All right, so welcome to panel 10, Interrogating the Narrative of Fear of Black Men as a Defense for the Unjust Killing of Black Males in America. I feel privileged of moderating this panel because this is basically 3 generations of my students doing work in Black male studies, some of which are now professors, others which are graduate students and just starting their graduate journey. So I'll begin with the first presenter, Mr. Michael Rene Taylor is an organizer, father, and philosophy student at Mary Baldwin University. He was born in Washington, D.C. in his areas of inquiry are Black male studies, social philosophy, literary theory, anti-colonial thought, and Pan-African socialism. Our second speaker is Miron Gilmore, husband, father, veteran, and PhD candidate in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and his research interests include Black male studies, anti-colonial philosophy, Black aesthetics, and Black nationalism. Dr. Bio, I'm gonna mess up your name, Bio, Oluwayomi, currently teaches courses in philosophy and the Black Experience in the Department of Philosophy at Howard University. He is also an ACLS postdoc fellow and research associate at the Leslie Center for the Humanities at Dartmouth College. His research interests include Africa, Africana Black philosophy, critical race theory, Black male studies, social epistemology, and anti-colonial philosophy. And he's basically published in all those areas. His research in Africana philosophy has received funding from the Moberg G. Glasscock Center for Humanities Research and the American Council for Learned Societies. His publications appear in American Philosophical Quarterly, Journal of Black Studies, International Journal of Humanities, Inter-American Journal of Philosophy, Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, and the APA Newsletter of Philosophy and the Black Experience. Our last speaker is Dr. Dalitso Ruwe, who holds a joint appointment as an assistant professor in Black political thought in the Philosophy and Black Studies departments at Queen's University. His research interests are intellectual history of Africana philosophy, anti-colonial theory, Africana legal history, Black male studies, and Black philosophies of education. His recent publications appear in the APA Newsletter for the Black Experience, Theory and Event, Teachers College Record, and the Blackwell Companion to Public Philosophy. So I'm looking forward to a very energetic and informative conversation and group of papers. So I believe the first speaker is Mr. Taylor.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Am I good to share my screen?
Yes.
All right. Does everyone pretty much see my screen? Perfect. I just first want to say that I'm extremely indebted to everyone on this panel, including Dr. Curry. These are some amazing men, and you know, they really are mentors to me, and I look up to them. I really couldn't say how excited I am to even, you know, be here and to be sharing this space with them. What I'm going to present here is titled Liminal Society, Genericism, and the Crisis of Overrepresentation of Black Male Death. So pretty much in this presentation, I'm going to argue for what I call a liminal society, how it best articulates how Black males are visibly represented in death in patriarchal societies broadly, but in the United States more particularly. And what I call a techno-liminality directly refutes what popular gender theorists argue is a Black male privilege via representation and visibility of police death. All right. So here, according to the Washington Post Fatal Force database for the year 2020, a socially distanced year, of the 241 Black people who were shot and killed by police, 239 of them were Black men. So more sobering to this reality is the fact that Black males such as George Floyd, who have been murdered by countless other lethal means, are not included in these data. So while this may come as a surprise to some, our contemporary theories of Black males explain these executional phenomena through the idea of visibility and representation on the one hand and the generics of racism on the other. What I mean by that is the overwhelming and disproportionate violence Black males experience by police is on the one hand said to be overrepresented insofar as Black male death is given attention and awareness, while on the other hand, these deaths serve as placeholders for all Black people, which dilute the specificity of racist misandrist violence. So later on in this presentation, I'm going to argue for a techno-liminality, which is going to refute this idea that Black men receive attention and awareness as a form of male privilege. So essentially here, what we're going to talk about is that though we understand that Black males are roughly 97% of those shot and killed by police, how we represent that becomes problematic because we add no real specificity to it. So the death of Black men becomes generic insofar as people explain it as something that occurs to Black people. And although it is certain that all Black people experience higher rates of being shot and killed by police, there's a uniqueness that is centered around racialized maleness that is not explained that well through our popular accounts of gender theory. So if it causes this kind of interesting dilemma. Essentially, if gender theory explains that police violence is targeted against Black males, either as a privilege via visibility, or if it reduces racism without any specificity around racialized maleness, then we lose the totality of what is at stake when analyzing the police of Black males. So Black male studies is going to argue that Black males are targeted for some of the most lethal forms of violence within Western patriarchal societies. Dr. Curry in particular argues that racism is a form of misandrous aggression. Where I'm going to intervene here is by placing Black males in what I call a liminal society to explain the machinations of police killings and how it antagonizes racialized maleness and overrepresents it as a representation of death and dying. So first, what I'm going to do is go through some of the literature which attempts to understand the experience of Black males and police violence under the rubric of gender theory. Then I'm going to cover some response rates to shooting Black males, after which I'll go ahead and flesh out exactly what a liminal society is and how that represents death and dying. So to be clear, I wanted to make sure that Black male studies here is going to account for how Black males are socially situated and impacted upon as embodied categories and interchangeable entities encumbered by various models of social terror. So this is not going to be a project about identity, but exegesis of how racialized maleness is constructed and torn apart and how it's organized and sanctioned for death under a white global structure. So the patriarchal apparatus of policing is just one such way that I'm going to explain this sex-specific violence. So section 1, gender racism and the logic of contemporary gender theory. Here, it's a paper that I actually like. It's by Jennifer Hartman, Derek Griffin, and Marino Bruce. Pretty much, this current model theorizes how Black men experience police violence, and it relies on the assumptions of race and gender and how that sort of like interacts in the social world. So said differently, it's pretty much a intersectional logic. It's called gender racism is a key to exposing and addressing police-involved shooting of unarmed Black men in America. And so pretty much they define racism as this organized system rooted in an ideology of inferiority that categorizes, ranks, and differentially allocates societal resources to human population groups. So in other words, though the authors are going to acknowledge that race and gender interact to inform how Black men experience the world, there is no real specificity to how Black males experience racialized maleness. So another way of saying this is there's no concept of how out males are targeted within patriarchy that you would get from like an Earl Miller, or there's no Black masculinity and sexual politics that you get from Anthony LaMille Jr. There's no kind of conceptualization of a subordinate male hypothesis that you would get from a Jim Sedanis, and there's no conceptualization of a phallicism that you would get from like a Dr. Curry. So in this sense, racism that Black men experience isn't really thought to encompass any sex-specific vulnerability. It relies solely on the caricatures and deviance of criminality. And while that's okay, what we want to argue here is that racialized maleness is a kind of maleness that differs from one constructed within patriarchy. So moving on to section 2, I'm going to give one empirical account towards forming a better understanding of racialized maleness and how that is in relation to the police murders of Black males. I'm going to start with this paper titled Selective Responses to Threat, the Roles of Race and Gender in Decisions to Shoot. And this paper here is by Plant Goblin and Kunstman. Essentially what they do in this paper here, they use a computer simulation to capture the ways that people decide who to shoot and kill in a matter of seconds. So the participants are pretty much given in the study are pretty much told to imagine they were police chasing suspected criminals. Some of the suspects are armed with guns while the others are holding objects and personal items or something like that. And so the idea is to pretty much shoot those who are holding guns and not to shoot those who are holding like weapons, but not weapons that are to kill anyone. So basically, the reason why they do this study is because they postulate that though a person's group membership is likely to influence how others perceive them as threats, not many studies properly examine any other social locations beyond race as it pertains to being targeted. So in a nutshell, what they end up finding is that white females, white males, and Black females, there is a bias away from shooting them, even when they're armed. And one of the foundational things that's pronounced in this study is how, as it pertains to Black males, the response to shoot Black males they shoot Black males essentially even when Black males do not have any weapons in their hand. So there's a bias towards shooting Black males even when they're unarmed. And so this should get us in the framework of analyzing why exactly that is, because there would be an assumption that this generic racism, there should be sort of like a reason why they would shoot towards Black females, but this study shows that that isn't the case. And so there's an additional study that I'll mention briefly that talks about Black men essentially having a likelihood of being killed by the police, 1 in 1,000 likelihood. And that means that being killed by the police for Black men is a 6th leading cause. So it's a leading cause for Black men. And so no other group has been murdered by police as a leading cause. So this should really get us to thinking why that is. So moving on to section 3, the liminal society, Black male studies and sociogenic analysis. I want to quickly pause here parenthetically to mention that how we explain the high rates of police violence in relation to Black males is based on a particular social ontology and epistemological underpinning we have for that group. So in other words, it's crucial to note that social meanings are important for how we produce knowledge about the rates for which Black males experience police violence. So research has shown that we derive meaning about intention, action, thinking, and knowledge from rates, but that meaning is derived from our social constructs. So the way that we understand the high rates of police brutality, the high rates of police killing Black males, informs how we think about Black males. So to give an example, I have these graphs here. I want to explain that when we look at this graph, we see how a person's shot to death by the U.S. police by race, gender, spheric origin over the past 5 years. This is only those who have been shot and killed. And one of the first things that people notice is that Black men, of course, have, the highest rate. What's interesting about this is what we tend to do is when we see this, we look at how all the males within their respective racial groups have higher rates than their female counterparts. And so because of that, we suggest that the thing that's driving this is racism, which it is racism, but maleness is not really given any significance because we look at this and we say, well, all males are, of course, have higher rates. So what's only driving this is racism. But I'm going to argue something different, because if you notice, all females who are killed in proportion to their males have similar rates. So if you see Black females is 0.7, Hispanic females 0.6, so on and so on. But what's interesting is Black men and Black women have the largest distance amongst them. And so one would assume that because both Black men and women experience anti-Black violence, that these groups would have the shortest distance, right? They would just the assumption because they both experience anti-Black violence. Of course, they're going to have the shortest distance, but this is not what this indeed shows. It shows that they have the largest distance. And in fact, if you divide the rates, so like if you divided 2.25 and divide that by 0.07, you'll actually get how many times more Black males are killed, and that's 32 times more. So that's more than any other racial and sex group. So what I'm going to argue is that distance, what's driving that distance is racialized maleness. And from this, there's something that I call the generic male fallacy. So what happens in the generic male fallacy is people attribute almost no value to racialized maleness as being targeted for police violence, because one, we assume that all maleness accords a sort of privilege, and two, we assume that all maleness functions towards patriarchy. So when we look at the high rates of police violence against Black men, we don't conceive of how maleness animates how racism functions. We simply reduce that function to what happens to Black people in general. And so there's a reason why we're attributing no significance to racialized maleness. In essence, maleness sort of like energizes, it animates how racism functions, but we typically don't attribute any value to that. And that's where that generic male fallacy comes in. So moving on, I'm going to articulate a rich society as the liminal society. So there, Ehrlich Beck, he argues a risk society that is due to the advent of industrialization with its presuppositions for modernization and technical knowledge. So he argues that our world has taken on an understanding of development that focus this use on technology of ending the ills of hunger at the expense of risk. So he talks about how the world became advanced in its capacity to secure material needs. It began to place its ideas of progress and technical knowledge into the hands of corporations that develop technology for profits at the expense of harms that it could cause society. So what he's essentially doing, he's going to argue against the colonial and neo-colonial thesis to argue that risk now is no longer associated with just the other, it's actually dominant and subordinate groups. However, I'm going to disagree with Beck, and I'm going to argue against that thesis by using expanding on Sylvia Winter's understanding of the new global poor in the category of the liminal, because she wants to say that while the expansion of technology and the master discipline of economics is exactly a thing, it's not the primary thing. And for her, what the primary thing is the cultural logic within the genre of Western man, which overrepresents itself as if it was the human itself. She calls this the superculture fallacy. So this overrepresentation motivates the development of those who are human, selected, and the underdevelopment of those groups who are deselected. And those environments are the environments that the liminal category, or those who lack the humanity, accrue all the risks within those capital and technological societies. So where I'm going to intervene really quick is I'm going to add policing to Winter's understanding and call this a liminal society, because while Winter does speak on the catastrophic risk in her paper, No Humans Involved, and the police killings of Black males, she doesn't explain it explicitly as a kind of risk society, and nor does she capture the police killings of Black males in general as a overrepresentation that also disappears their racialized maleness as outgroup males within a patriarchal society. So essentially, liminal society is constituted of those who are made to represent the lack of the human and pay the hidden cause of the current epistemological genre of the human. So while also accumulating all the risk of living in an environment whose master discipline of technological progress and economics serves to perpetuate their death and dying. So to be clear, what I'm doing here is basically placing Black males in the ways they are harmed in police within what I term a liminal society. And from that, I'm going to derive what I call techno-liminality. So remember at the beginning, I mentioned how popular gender theory suggests that the death of Black males by police garner attention and visibility. And this representation is a kind of male privilege because the focus on Black men is due to their prototypability as males in a patriarchal society. Techno-liminality is going to argue directly against that claim. Also remember that I mentioned in a risk society, or what I have expanded on as a liminal society, is that there's this expansion of technological advancement that produces risks that are both unseen and ubiquitous. So in this sense, techno-liminality is how the public, our master disciplines in economic and technological advancement collude with each other to plague the overrepresentation and death of Black males as a kind of representation of death and dying. So all of the claim that Black men are represented in death, that we march for Black men, is actually a representation of dying. And I believe this to be very specific to Black males within the liminal category, because as the category which is symbolically made to represent that which lacks humanity, their representation of death as representation of death seeks to normalize our current order by legitimizing who is in fact supposed to die. So if you think about the intersectional logic, if we think about the most privileged category, we would assume that to be white men. Yet we never see them represented in death through social media, through 24-hour news cable, through police cameras, right? So like we have to ask ourselves, why in fact aren't they being represented when we know they actually die at the hands of police? In fact, by mere population numbers, white men actually die more than black men, but black men have higher rates. So why is it that we never kind of see the collusion of technology, which is supposed to help us bring awareness, actually, bring awareness for black men? What it does is it actually represents death. So by arguing against this idea that black males are the prototypical members and that this visibility of death actually garners them a privilege, which is argued in Purdy Vaughn and Ibach's paper, Intersectional Invisibility, I'm arguing against that by suggesting that these technologies actually collude with our present order to, in fact, represent death and dying. And this has a genealogy in lynching where we see the photograph actually being used as a means of memory that travels through space and time, as David Marriott suggests in Black Men. So though some would argue that black males are always spoke of, are represented in media, I'm going to argue that techno-liminality refutes that understanding, because it shows us that overrepresentation of death is actually representation of death. And I'll end there.
We're not doing questions, we're just.
Right, just keep going.
Okay. Mr. Gilmore?
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay. So my presentation is titled, This is the Nature of the Threat. So contrary to the grand narratives of civil rights and racial progress that emphasize positive changes in American social life as a result of broad legislative changes in the late 20th century to the benefit of Black Americans, Black males experience a peculiar and enduring social and economic marginality in this period that I argue amounts to gendercide. So today, the conditions of gendercide, in other words, that were pointed out by scholars and activists in the early 1950s, these conditions remain in the Black community today. So if you look at sociological literature and demography, you'll see Black males have the highest unemployment rates and the lowest employment rates among men. They have the highest levels of violent death rates. They compete for the highest in the hemisphere. Black males suffer uniquely from police killings, as Rene just covered. And they also account for a large majority of the race gaps and intergenerational poverty and have lower rates of upward mobility. And like I said, on December 17, 1951, Paul Robeson and William Patterson submitted a petition to the United Nations entitled We Charge Genocide. And in 1951, they argued that conditions of genocide still existed in the Black community. And they used the UN definition of genocide for this purpose. But later on, approaching the 21st century, you get academic theories trying to articulate genocide and certain patterns of genocide. But right before this, you see Black sociologists doing so. And they use these ideas around internal colonization. They use particularly Robert Staples, right? He wants to argue that Black males are surplus labor. They're situated by the oligarchical capitalist ruling class of America through prison, military, and early death by homicide victimization systematically. And these attempts have helped us understand this phenomenon, but we need an even more holistic understanding of gendercide, because these accounts lack a sex-specific account or explanation of the repression of Black males. And you'll see this in Robert Allen's update to his internal colonialism thesis in 2005. He will tell you that they did not anticipate the repression of young Black males from 14 to 44 in the Black liberation movement. It was unseen. And so we have later on in the 21st century, contemporarily, we do have scholarship grounded in Black male studies that has differentiated itself from a kind of intersectionality for men, and it has articulated this guiding theoretic to explain the dynamics of Black male sexual victimization called phallicism. But in this work, what I want to do is situate social dominance theory on the basis of its ability to provide us with an empirically oriented approach to understanding Black male genocide. And I'm also going to introduce here what I consider and what I call a primary contradiction of our current epistemological and ontological order. And I call this killology. And I'll get to this toward the end. Now, with social dominance theory, which is contrasted with intersectional invisibility theory in the literature, I'm arguing this empirical theoretical lens, not only because of its empirical account, but in demonstrating its empirical validity, what it also does is adapt on those former anti-colonial, internal colonialism theories of the late 20th century, right? So it does that as well, and I want to give it credit for that. And what I'm going to do is, first, I'm going to break this up in three parts. So I'm going to introduce institutional decimation, because I think it's a good characterization of the tone of Black sociology in the late 20th century. Then I'm going to move into an explanation of social dominance theory, contrasted with intersectional invisibility theory. After that, I'm going to outline what I consider to be two defects of intersectional invisibility theory. And then I'm going to introduce a new philosophical paradigm I call killology, as a way to explain Black male gendercide today. So their work, Institutional Decimation, sociologists James B. Stewart and Joseph Scott argue that that being institutional decimation is the primary factor in explaining the imbalance in the sex ratio of Black Americans during that time. And with them, what they wanted to do was explain how Black males are programmatically eliminated from the Black community. And they observed this as the killing of every 10th man and the sex ratio. And they demonstrate this from 1920 to 1970. And they also argue, as the quote says, to clarify the concept of decimation, because they want to show how the male population is over time put through a process of attrition. And they understand the process of internal colonialism and subjugation of the Black community causes certain economic frustrations. So on the one hand, there are aggressive responses induced by economics like crime, bouts of unemployment, vice, but then there's the public assistance complex and the educational system and the healthcare delivery systems that also produce similar frustrations to the same outcome. And so they use these frustrations of the Black community to explain why Black men are overrepresented, not only in prison, but also in the military, and also why Black men eventually stay in the military longer than other groups of men, which they see as what they call temporary elimination. Homicide is permanent elimination, right? So they look at the mortality data going up to 45, and they outline 3 roles for institutional decimation. So the first one is to contain the pressures of the Black community. The second one is to maintain a balance between the number of white and Black males. And the third one is to promote social instability through increased sexual competition for available Black males. So like I said, these economic pressures of the Black community cause certain kinds of crime to persist, and this ends up with temporary forms of separation through the military or prison. But they also look at the Office of Vital Statistics, and they argue that the outcomes of Black males are due to a general socioeconomic circumstance of the entire Black community, right? So it starts at birth, literally, and the socioeconomic condition of the Black community basically eliminates its males. Now today, we have new ways of approaching this. Like I said, we have social dominance theory. And you see this in early 2000s. So you see Dr. Sedanius and Dr. Venegas outlining social dominance theories. This 3-part system, right? They want to argue that hierarchies in modern capitalist societies have an age system, a patriarchal system, and an arbitrary set system. And the most important distinction that I'll cover here is that the arbitrary set system is the most lethal. It's also the most, it has the most plasticity. So filial relations between men and women soothe violence between men and women, but arbitrary set violence is the most violent. That's what I want to emphasize here. You see it across genocides. So the formulation of this paradigm in social dominance theory took issue with early 1980s accounts of the double jeopardy hypothesis, or the feminist account of patriarchy that looks like a kind of proto-intersectionality, where the idea is that being a woman and being a member of a subordinated group causes more than just being a male of a subordinated group. So in response to account for the economic and empirical distinction between the types of violences arbitrary set group males experience and patriarchal sets experience, they introduced a subordinate male target hypothesis. A little more than a decade later, they generalized this hypothesis to a theory of gender prejudice. They clarify several positions. And most importantly, are three qualifications. The most important one I'll cover here, just for time's sake, is that they want to say that you don't need subordination in order for intergroup conflict to take place. Okay, so when they look at it later, they want to maintain that, look, it's not always that there are social subordinate and dominance relations that drives intergroup conflict or arbitrary set violence, but it can be the case. So against this framework, you have Purdy Vines and Richard Eibach hypothesize intersectional invisibility. And what they want to say is that groups who do, persons with group identities within marginalized groups who don't fit the prototypes of those respective groups for arbitrary set violence from the dominant group are oppressed because they're ignored, okay? And when they're looking at this, they concede the empirical validity of the social dominance theory and the subordinate male target hypothesis. But they want to say that androcentrism, ethnocentrism, and heterocentrism is going to make it to where men, for example, Black men are going to be targeted, and those who have intersecting subordinate group identities on those dimensions that are not prototypical are going to be ignored. So they want to shift the grounds here. They want to shift the grounds from who is killed to who is ignored, right? So we're struggling for recognition by the end of by the time we get through with the introduction of the intersectional invisibility framework, despite the concession to subordinate male target hypothesis, right? Now, Black male studies scholarship has showed us how contradictory this position is. But for my part, I want to also expand on this position. I want to argue that one of the limitations is its ahistoricity, right? So what we don't see in historical instances of genocides is genocide heirs give positive attention to a non-prototypical member of an outgroup, and that outgroup be saved from genocidal violence. I use the example of the Second Reich colonization of Southwest Africa as an example in the Kaiser's Holocaust. But this is evident going back to warfare patterns in the 17th century and internecine violence that got birthed at the system of slavery. So you see internecine conflict underwriting genocides going back to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, not this phenomenon where non-prototypical members can be recognized and it wane. And you see criminologists, I cite criminologist Nicole Rafter, she verifies this and places social dominance theory within a historical framework. She gives a typology of genocides, and in every genocide she looks at, post-genocidal societies look like low-level warfares, low-level warfare engagements. What you have is intergroup conflict at a varying level that can sometimes increase and sometimes decrease. And so that type of dynamism is just not captured by intersectional visibility. But also, if you look at the psychological research out there that looks at the evolutionary underpinnings of human representational systems, as Colin Halbrook does in his paper, Looming Large in the Eyes of Others, published in 2016, you can see that this idea that prototypicality leads to subordinate male target hypothesis, it doesn't follow, it's a non sequitur. Okay, so what actually happens is the lower the status of the outgroup person, the more violence can be levied on that person. And so this is what the evidence from social psychology suggests. So on multiple fronts, the intersectional visibility thesis just doesn't hold up. But when it comes to explaining Black male gendercide and capturing this low-level warfare, as I said, Black male studies has offered a different kind of theoretic called phallicism, which takes issue with social dominance theory, heterosexism, and it also brings us to attention with the homoerotic tendencies of this types of violence. So what it's going to do is capture how subordinate males and racialized male groups are going to be able to be simultaneously imagined to be sexual predators and threats, and constituted by the psychosocial fantasies of the dominant group as sexually desirous, and therefore rapeable and sexually vulnerable. But it does not place these dynamics within a population-centric paradigm of warfare. And so I want to fill that gap in by introducing the notion of killology. Okay, so when you look at the history of counterinsurgency warfare with its roots in colonial warfare, I offer killology as an analytic to understand Black male genocide today and delimit the reification fallacy, which is introduced as a supercultural fallacy by Sylvia Winter. So in this post-World War II innovations in military technology and formulation of practice around counterinsurgency and maneuver warfare theory at home and abroad, the aspiration to accomplish artificial general intelligence and the accomplishment of autonomous lethal weapons, killology implies that the US empire has perfected the act of killing and the pacifying of enemy populations, individuals, and changed the relationship between knowledge and power fundamentally. Okay. Now the roots of the relationship between counterinsurgency and US empire is located in Huey P. Newton's theory of intercommunalism. He identifies this technology as very central to counterinsurgency and anticipates American scholars in identifying this doctrinal formulation of counterinsurgency. But it's also important to outline just what this is, because it can sound esoteric. But counterinsurgency is basically contrasted to military industrialized style warfare. This is a population-centric paradigm. It is not a paradigm of conflict between two fighting units. It is armed social work. Okay, in her work on the rise of mass incarceration within the liberal paradigm and reformulation of counterinsurgency in the late 20th century, Time in the Shadows, Dr. Khalili explains that counterinsurgencies have a sexual specific approach that's verified by Black male studies research and the empiricism in social dominance theory. So what we see, she gives an example, a good example, but she gives them in Israel, Palestine, Madagascar, Algeria. But the one I liked was from the former State Department representative, Colonel H.R. McMaster, when he conquered the city of Tal Afar in Iraq. She explains that all men were fair game, and that this is the tendency in counterinsurgency warfare. And so when we also see another analog to this is demonization of the enemy. And I think social dominance theory and Black male studies also helps us explain and understand this. But we also see this happening simultaneous with this formulation of counterinsurgency in the late 20th century with Rene Curtis as the head of HUD, arguing that the criminal justice system must be formulated to punish for punishment to deter a non-white enemy whose psychology the white power brokers of this nation presume to understand. And I think what you see in the criminalization of Black men and Black protests and Black radicalism in general is the equivocation of criminality with terrorism, propensity toward terrorism. And for two examples, you get this with Assata Shakur being put on the terrorist list by President Barack Obama, the demonizing of Black radicalism. But you also get this in the academic research that compares Huey P. Newton to Osama bin Laden. And so in her work, like I said, the reification fallacy of Sylvia Winter, I'm arguing that this new technology, this new implementation of counterinsurgency since the 20th century constitutes a new problematic for all human being and knowledge, okay? So she argues that her fallacy has three conditions. The first is the linguistic synodoche between man and the human. The second is the institutionalization of European definition of humanity in terms of rationality since the 15th century. And the third is the identification of interests that secure the well-being of that class, a Eurocentric projection of man for the human species as a whole. And I argue that this accomplishment and use and weaponization of social science toward killology, the killing act itself and counterinsurgency, this is a new condition of being. This is the new contradiction of the new schema of man. We have knowledge that's animated toward killing, pacifying populations. All populations outside of the horizons of US security interests will be warred upon and assimilated thereafter. And that's the end.
So I think, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So I just want to say thank you to Miron and Rene just to set the pace and set the tone for this conversation today. So because of time, I'm just going to jump right into my talk, looking at the fear of Black men, a finding cartography of anti-Black misandry as psychosexual pathology. So I came to this research, just trying to look at the very popular common narrative about Black men as being very dangerous, as you can see from my slide, right? Dangerous Black men. And so I started to understand how law enforcement in America continue to use this trope, this sort of narrative to get away from crimes, even when these crimes are recorded on video, right? And so I thought that within Black male studies, this is something that we need to investigate. And I thought Fanon helps us with this theory of racial phobogenics to try to uncover this narrative as a form of psychosexual pathology. So that's what I'm going to be arguing, and just because of time, show some aspect of Fanon's work that really helps to theorize this notion. And so what is really interesting about this narrative about the fear of Black men is that in every, most of the situations where police officers in America kill Black men and boys, they make this argument and say, oh, I killed because I feared for my life. So even though we do see evidence that the Black males are often unarmed and undeserving of death and dying. And so the narrative of fear is often used to portray a picture of the necessity to obliterate something dangerous, something unwanted, a dangerous, threatening thing from the face of the earth. And most times when these narratives are put up, it is done to assuage the feelings of any would-be sympathizers to the plight of Black males in America. I do want to just say ahead that I have a few images on my slide that people could find distressing, but I really think that we need to see those images, to unpack what I'm really talking about here, because when we speak about the death and the dying of Black males in America, it is better to speak with factual data rather than hypothetical conjectures. I don't think that's something that a luxury that we can afford as Black men within empire. And so I'll begin my talk with a case study. Some of us may be familiar with this case study. So the officer on the slide is Betty Shelby, a white police officer who was captured on video in 2016. She literally killed Terrence Clutcher, and she claimed in the court that she had feared for her life because she thought that he was reaching for his gun. So we can see the image, right? It's the physical evidence right there is so clear. But the court, of course, filled with most white members of jury, acquitted Shelby of first-degree murder because she feared. So fear then became a rational justification and exculpatory evidence for killing at will, basically. And we see this pattern of citing fear as an excuse for killing Black men and boys, also in the death of Philando Castile in 2016 as well. We know that Officer Yanez, who killed them, also claimed that he had feared for his life, and that's why he had shot him to death. So in these cases and many others like it, that involves the death of Black men and boys, what it really unravels and unpacks for us is this unmistakable fact that is Black male life in America is easily disposable. It is a necessary racial sacrifice, to use the words of Derek Bell. Derek Bell talks about, racial sacrifice that we have to spill, the blood that needs to be spilled in order to assuage the feelings and the comfort of white folks. And so the reality is that we live in a society where police officers and white vigilantes can conveniently claim that they were uniquely afraid of Black boys and men as a justification to end their lives. So the task of my paper then is to, like I started by talking about Fanon, is to use Fanon's concept of racial phobogenics to analyze some of the fatal and dangerous consequences of the negative characterizations of Black males as bodies that needs to be feared, tamed, and silenced permanently. And so Fanon's concept of racial phobogenics is this sort of process of making a race and gendered body into something that it is not. It is a transformation that is happening at the metaphysical, ontological levels, and also the empirical level. So it is a broad transformation and the remaking of the Black body, the Black male body, into something that it is not. In other words, when you, and I think something that you were talking about earlier, Miron, about the arbitrary set of violence under social dominance theory gets to this as well. That when it comes to the remaking and the re-engineering of Black male bodies, the plasticity, it's open to different forms of construction. I can literally argue that you deserve to die because you make me uncomfortable, because I fear that you have some evil intent, even when you have the most, the best of intent. So literally, the life of a Black male then becomes something that becomes fungible within hegemonic context. And I believe in my work, I call this out as a form of anti-Black misandry that is born out of psychosexual pathology. So specifically, I want to look at a few sections in Black Skin, White Mask, where Fanon was actually trying to unpack this. So in Black Skin, White Mask, I have the quote on the slide. Fanon described a transaction between a white mother and a son who expressed paralyzing, racializing fear upon contact with him on the street or public space. Upon citing Fanon, a Black abnormality within the cocoon of representation that normalizes whiteness, the young white boy called out, "Maman, look, a Negro, I'm scared, I am afraid, I'm scared." Literally, what Fanon is then saying is that the realities of Black male lived experience within racializing context is the depicting of the body schema, a body schema that you don't even own. So as a Black male being in predominantly white spaces, being in a hegemonic context, your body and your reality is not even owned by yourself, because you can be reconstructed in the white imagination as something that is negating, something that needs to be feared, and something that needs to be put down. And so Fanon then is saying, with this, in Black Skin, White Mask, that even in the very ways the white kid, the white male is socialized to think of Black male bodies, there is a psychological thing there that has to do with fear. The fear is built in from childhood to adulthood. That's the genius of Fanon. So Fanon then says, through this sort of psychosexual pathology that is developed in white men from an early age that they carry into adulthood, there is this reconstruction, a recalibration of a phobogenic object. It becomes an object, a phobogenic object, because phobia is moved into what it means to be a biological being. So Fanon is also bringing a complex contraption of ontology, biology, and gendered embodied racism to this notion of phobogenic object. So who is the phobogenic object for Fanon? The phobogenic object is the Black male. He is projected as a deviation from the social categories of power and as a dangerous threat within human community. He doesn't belong to the human community. So in Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon then considers the common citation of fear as a justification for killing Black males as an irrational fear that plays on the stereotype of Black men as a socially deviant and violent being that needs to be subdued. So when we use Fanon's phobogenics, I think that we can then begin to challenge these notions, these inherently, toxic notions that we get on social media, that we make go trendy, in our life, and we accept it as something that we cannot do nothing about, right? So what does it then mean to begin to rethink through this notion of phobogenics, how whiteness works? And you know what? I also went as far as researching the ways in which police officers are trained regarding how they should engage with Black male bodies. And at some point, I'll be showing some data from actual government documents that shows that even in the very ways white police officers are trained to engage with a Black body, it's always from the point of death. So I like this quote from Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, which I like to also look at a little bit before I get into this government document that I was talking about earlier. So Fanon then says, the aftermath of the gaze of the police officers, the powerful white men on the black male body, when it's reimagined, when it's reframed in the white imagination, this is what happens. He says, quote, "My body was returned to me spread-eagled, disjointed, redone, draped in mourning on this winter day. This Negro is an animal. This Negro is bad. This Negro is wicked. The Negro is ugly. Look, a Negro. The Negro is trembling because he's cold. The boy is trembling because he's afraid of the Negro." There is the problem of dual fear. One fear is cold, natural instinct, and the other is fear, psychological fear that has been imbibed. So he goes forward to say the Negro is trembling with cold, the cold that chills the bones. The lovely little white boy is trembling because he thinks the Negro is trembling with rage. The little boy runs to his mother, "Mama, the Negro is going to eat me." So what Fanon reveals here is how he's being framed in negative light, when in reality, he was really suffering from the effects of cold weather. So this is similar to the reality of Black men and boys in the United States, whose suffering are discountenanced and whose desperate pleas for life are ignored in situations where they are confronted with police brutality and white vigilante violence. The little white boy in this narrative account, it's projecting his racial anxieties onto Fanon as a Black male cannibal who is going to devour him. This is not an accidental, occasional display of sudden emotion fear. It's a deep expression of fear, internalized fear that emits such paralyzing, irrational emotion communicated in this phrase, "the Negro is going to eat me." So what this shows is the weaponization of white fear against Black males often involves projecting them as object of anxieties and racial phobogenics. And so Fanon's concept of racial phobogenics entails the process of making the Black body into this object of anxiety that could be subjected to the most visceral reactions human puts up against what they naturally fear. And that's the genius of social dominance theory as well, because in the arbitrary set discrimination, they also argue that the most kinds of violence is the most grotesque under the arbitrary set, because you can reconstruct it however you want, because that body has already been dehumanized. It's not really a body that has humanity in it. And that's why Black male studies is so refreshing, because it pulls off these nonsense, toxic ways of reading Black men to get to the humanity of the Black male experience, the humanization, even though it involves theorization of the death of men and boys, but the ultimate goal is the humanization, the humanity that's been taken away. And that's why Sylvia Winter's paper, Rene, as you were referencing in your talk, in your piece, is that no humans involved. Black male studies is reclaiming the toxicity that we've built into the very ways that we've been socialized to think about the race and gender bodies in this society. So I like to cite evidence from the US Commission on Civil Rights, which is a bipartisan independent commission of the United States federal government. This is government data. This is not my opinion. Created by the Civil Rights Act of 1957. In this report, it was found and stated that the logic of fear is built into the way police men and women are trained. Quote, "Police are therefore taught to shoot before a threat is fully analyzed, because messages such as hesitation with a Black male can be fatal, or complacency with Black men kills. These are reinforced consistently throughout an officer's training." So when this happens, this is how policemen and women are trained. Police reform experts then argue that this type of formal training and informal conversation that highlight and exacerbate and perpetuate fear increase the likelihood that an officer may use excessive force. As I approach the conclusion of my presentation, I'd like to also state that a Fanonian analysis provides us a lens to view this fabrication of the fear of Black men or Black males as a deadly misandric aggression. The notion of fear is often used to justify, or as a justification or rationale for killing of Black men and bodies by white police officers and vigilantes is nothing but a fabrication. So that needs to be said. So Fanon gets us to that account. It's a fabrication that is invented to mirror the historical racist stereotypes of Black males as dangerous brutes that deserve to be put down. It is also used as a smoking to galvanize support from white people who may otherwise be averse to such visceral and lethal violence being perpetrated against Blacks. I think many of us will remember this picture, this image. and that was cited in the same document that I used for my research, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights 2018 report on the use of force in policing, right? So this is the former South Carolina police officer, Michael Slager, who was convicted of shooting death of Walter Scott, right? So, but what's interesting is, these quotes from this commission, the report, even though the evidence, video evidence shows that Scott was actually running away from him, he went to court and said, oh, I still fear for my life, and that's why I killed him. I shot him 5 times in the back. So this appears to my mind in research that it's something that we need to theorize, that the fabrication of fear as a small screen is a small screen. It's a small screen, and police officers know that when they cite this, they can avoid legal sanctions for applying unwarranted lethal force against Black people. And I think the question then becomes, what do we do? I think, Miron, Clay, what you're saying about counterinsurgency becomes important. What do we do? I think first we need to unpack what it is, call it out for what it is. Because these magic words should not be sufficient to absolve mothers of the killing of Black men and boys. So I'll end here by saying that what I've really tried to establish in my talk briefly is just this notion that the fear used by police officers is unjustified. It's really a fabrication. And when we look at finance, phobogenics, racial phobogenics, it gives us everything that we need to know about, the fabrication, and that how Black men are sort of constructed as something that is otherwise good. And so I think that in Black male studies, we really have to push back against these sort of psychosexual pathologies and absolutely reject it whenever it's offered as justification for killing Black men and boys. So that's where I will end. Thank you.
Okay, can everybody hear me fine? Okay, it is a pleasure to be here. This panel, these brothers mean so much to me, Dr. Curry. So I'm excited to be here. What I'll present here is an outline of one of the chapters I'm working on. I'm working on a book project that really traces the history of violence against Black males through the sciences, right? So I have a chapter that looks at natural history and how that justified cannibalism of Black males on slave ships. I have a chapter that's looking at phallometric studies, the way in which the idea you can study the Black male penis, bred a lot of violence. I have a chapter looking at eugenics. In this particular formulation, I would talk about psychosis and the way psychosis has been used to justify killings of Black males. And then I have a chapter on the legal system. So please ask questions. I'm excited to be here. I'll get straight to the presentation so we can head to the Q&A. So in the early formulations of Black male studies, Dr. Curry published an article at the onset of Mike Brown, and really implored us and scholars to say, we need to take up a genre of Black male death, to study the ways in which caricatures are given legitimacy as the ways in which Black men are killed. We study Black males through pathological assumptions and not the empirical world, right? From this formulation, Dr. Curry's book, The Man Not, explore the way ethnology in the 19th century has still undergirded our formulations of Black males as either hypersexual, criminals, and the justifications that then we have within the social sciences, humanities, and even the civil societies, the way we talk about Black males as pathological beings, right? The text, as we've all read, hopefully, and if you're over there, get the book, ask the man to sign it for you. It's a great text, right? He goes through this excavation of ethnology and this notion of caricatures. So in my work, I take up this notion of caricatures really seriously, right? So article that I just published really interrogates this fundamental assumptions of eugenics. Eugenics emanating from the 19th century was a science about population control. And the way Black men were studied in this particular formulation of the science was that Black men epigenetically have criminal genes in them, right? So eugenics was then saying we need to figure out ways to disrupt these genes from Black males and then not propagate a race of criminals. So eugenics then legitimizes vasectomies, sterilizations, and then I also trace this in chokeholds that happens, and even in mass shootings. Black males, when you read manifestos from mass shooters, are at the epicenter, right? These notions of feeble-mindedness, heterosexual, being hypersexual, lower IQ, give justifications to violence. So I've gone through autopsies from recent Black males who have died, who have been in the public sphere, and I show how in the autopsies themselves, we see this reiteration about Black males' ontogenic sensibilities as being born with genes of criminality, right? So in this particular talk, I'll talk about psychosis, right? And very much picking up on Bayo's point. If we remember the very brilliant line that Fanon starts off with in Black Skin, White Mask, he says, look, beyond ontology and phylogeny, there's sociogeny, right? The way in which we have to study the way psychiatry itself has created particular formulations of Black men, which then Bayo's pointed to, the phobia that comes from that. We have particular forms of knowledge in psychiatry themselves that legitimize the forms of violence that we see against Black males. So in this particular talk, I'll trace a history within the confines of North America, and specifically to the American context, how psychiatry has engendered a particular formulation of Black males as being deranged and therefore should be killed. Okay, so a recent study has shown that Black males, particularly at the age of 55 in the Midwest, have a propensity to be killed by police officers at a rate of five times higher than white males, right? So if a Black male who is in the age group post 50 plus exudes signs of mental illness, they have a high probability of being killed. This is one of the first studies that's actually looking at the way in which mental health, race, and this notion of armed or unarmed function at the onset of death. So as Rene had showed, right, Black males between the ages of 0 to 25 or 35 and below, they have a higher rate of being killed, whether they're armed or unarmed. This study is really looking at the phenomena of unarmedness or armed and at the age being 50 and mental health, right? So it could be anything from having a cell phone in your hands, a pen in your hands, and how that legitimizes the forms of violence, right? So I'm really interested in this to say, well, how has this come to be a phenomenon? What is really interesting in the literature in psychiatry is to say this, right? A recent study has said, systematic review, since 1970, right, in the 1980s, Black people are overrepresented as being diagnosed with psychosis, right? So since the 1980s, and this should signal something to us, right? At the onset of the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, when people have been trying to understand this population coming into these civic spaces, there is an overrepresentation of Black people being misdiagnosed as being psychotic and having schizophrenia. One of the things I find interesting in the literature, and this is coming from this actual systematic review, there is no empirical basis to actually to verify why Black people are overanalyzed as being psychotic. There is no actual empirical basis of why, right? But it's still to say, since the 1980s, there's an overrepresentation of Black people. So, and this is to say, irrespective of race, right? We still see that whether you go on to somebody who is a Black psychologist, you will still be identified with this particular form of schizophrenia. And this is global, right? In a different setting, I show how this is happening in Canada, in Portugal, in Sweden, even in all across Europe, right? Black people across the board are overrepresented and misdiagnosed as having schizophrenic tendencies. This is of interest to me because, again, when we go back to the 19th century, right, these formulations become important to psychoanalysis and psychiatry. One of the first times we see this notion within the confines of America is a Yale psychiatrist who's working at Yale and saying this notion of phylogenic origins of Black people and their relation to Africa. So in this age, right, phylogenic notions were linked back. I got me. They were linked back to Africa. So this notion was really that in the race, right, in the individual, you can trace the history of the race. And why this was fascinating is that Black men became the embodiment of this thing about tracing back to the race. So this should read much like Freud's idea of the conscious and unconscious mind, right? The notion that psychosis in Black people comes from Africa. We can trace back their ancestral traditions, customs, and religions became central to psychiatry to study these notions of psychosis. Why did this matter? Here's a case example in which Linda spends about 12 case samples talking about Black males as being psychotic because of their traditions and customs from Africa. In one example, he has a patient who says, look, I want to kill my wife, eat my wife. And he says, look, we can trace this back to Africans being cannibalists. At the very epicenter of who they are, their traditions are linked back to Africa and all these things. Another case in which a Black male talks about the way in which he has a lot of kids. The argument put forward is that Black men back in Africa, polygamist, right? To be a chief, you have to have a whole lot of kids. So they link psychosis back to Africa, right? Not the environment or the society in which these people are, but it's something to say about the millennial and the cultural norms that they have from Africa, right? This will become a prominent theme, a similar notion of the ontogenic level, meaning the manifestations of a culture or a people's physical phenotypes. This will become important too. The notion of voodoo, the idea that Africans and the religions and customs that they have are play out in the affects they have, the artifacts they have, becomes central to this belief, right? So we see African traditions, custom linked back and talking about psychosis, meaning they say Black people can't function without white civilization, all right? In the midst of white civilization, they're having a hard ability because they're not in Africa, right? The notion of psychosis is linked back to African cultural affect as decadent. In the 1960s, this similar phenomenon will be important. We will see psychiatrists at the University of Baltimore, right, saying similar arguments to say, look, how do we study schizophrenia in Black men? What causes schizophrenia in Black men and doesn't cause them in some men, right? The argument that says we can study the cultural affects, the communal aspect they come from, the society they live in, which is to say the subclasses they live in, right? The type of relationships they have. So this particular study says, look, one way to think about this is to interrogate the ways in which Black men's relationships to their community, to each other, create particular forms of psychosis. So the three characteristics given here to say, one, because Black men have a propensity to have a desire for homosexual relationship that causes psychosis. So we start to read in the 1960s, this notions that Black men, because they may have a fluidity and sexual ability to have multiple partners, becomes central again to this idea that the homosexual relationship a Black man has causes psychosis. Similar to that argument is the one in the household, because the Black man is not in the household or is very feminine, it causes psychosis in Black males. The third argument put forward is the peer group relationships that they have. So this becomes the formulation of studying psychosis in the 1960s about Black males, right? Their desire to have homosexual relationship, the household having no strong father becomes central to this argumentation, and even the peer group relationships that they have. This has become important. Psychiatry is formulating this notion of psychosis based on these notions. Again, this should read as interesting because the 1960s, the similar arguments about peer group relationships matter in the ways in which they start talking about riots, right? In Detroit in the 1960s, as the riots were happening, Black people coming back from Vietnam, they're celebrating each other. Medical doctors are saying, look, we need to study the role of disease in the brain of the Negro. And why this is important is because then we need to have clinical studies pinpointing exactly what should be done to their brains. 1960, right? The idea here is to say something is wrong fundamentally with the male Negro, and particular forms of violence should be used to make sure that they don't, the ability to be hyper-violent, as this is being termed, has to be lessened because it's a threat to civil society. Why is this important? This is important because in the 1970s, we see lobotomies against Black boys. All right, the University of Mississippi, we actually see Black boys having lobotomies given to them because they are deemed to be a threat. The idea that in the brain of the Negro is this propensity to be violent, right? The argument that was put forward was that dangerous ideas, right? Violence begins in the mind. So if we could do something to the mind, we lessen the propensity for these men to come up to be violent, right? And this will be important because, again, this will happen to the ways in which the 1980s, the CIA is testing out drugs on Black men in prisons. Right? This becomes central to the notion. So when we talk about hyperviolence, right, there's notions of the caricatures of Black males being hyperviolent. Society has legitimized particular forms of violence. Lobotomies were performed on Black boys. They should say to us and signal to us the same way the school system overdoses Black boys on special education. It's the same argument, the same trajectory is being put forward about the dangerous forms of violence Black men have, and particularly with psychiatry, their mind, right? If we can do something to their mind, we can lessen the threat of violence, right? A similar argument again in the 1960s, right? A notion of protest psychosis. The idea that because Malcolm X, right, is talking about the Black Power movement, right? He's talking about African values. Psychiatrists are saying we're starting to see Black men as being violent given these African notions that they have. This is the same argument in the 20th century, early 20th century, as I started off the talk, 1960s. So Malcolm X, actually by the FBI, is deemed to be psychotic. Robert F. Williams, when he's talking about arm these Negroes with guns, is deemed to be psychotic, right? So the rebelling against America's forms of racism, psychologists are saying these men are psychotic. This will become central to, again, the formulations of why they should be incarcerated. This idea, we have to lessen this ability to function in society, right? So again, just to talk about this, right? So the argument put forward is that there's something about these African values that is going up against white supremacy and the notions that are central to white civilization. It is ludicrous to think that white people are crazy, but it's really that African values themselves and the traditions these people come from engender psychosis in them, right? This is important because in the 1980s, again, a new phenomenon called excited delirium will become central to these argumentations, right? What happens is in Florida, a coroner started to make a case that, look, we're starting to see an overrepresentation of Black male death given crack cocaine, right? So the argument is, and what was interesting is that they were trying to figure out, is this because of police violence or is this something germane to Black men? What the argument then said was the recreational drugs themselves are the reasons why there's an overrepresentation of Black death, right? This case, this took off because of Len Bias. So Len Bias was a prominent basketball player, right? He was about to be taken up to the NBA, out with the homies, having a good time, ends up overdosing and is dead, right? They tack that on to be then the basis of this new phenomenon of a psychotic nature in which Black men are either hyper strong, violent people who need more than one police officer to bring them down, right? So tradition of psychosis, right, which says Black men are so violent, the tag on this new phenomenon. And as I'll end the talk a little bit, I'll show that this argument is being used contemporary in new forms to justify the violence, right? But just to say, the 1980s, we started to see a formulation that recreational drugs can do such damage to Black men that they become superordinate beings that then have to be corralled by more than one police officer. This argument is given credence as part of the psychological literature and becomes essential to what happens in autopsies. Why this is fascinating is excited delirium is not an actual phenomenon. It doesn't exist, right? But this was made up by a coroner who then had the backing of psychiatrists and psychologists, so much so that it's carried on since the 1980s, right? A recent review that just got published recently is showing that in emergency rooms, it's the same argument being put forward about Black men, all right? We start to see this idea that even in 2017, when Black men end up in the emergency room and they need more than one person to bring them down, their death is caused not on the violence and their restraints, but something about them. And it's linked back to something recreational that they were doing, right? Not the ways in which the forms of violence are being used to bring them down, but there's something psychotic. He's so deranged that he's out of his mind, right? This was central to how they talked about Eric Garner's case, George Floyd's case, right? It has become a global phenomenon to think of the psychotic nature of Black men needing more than one restraint and giving credence to this, right? So part of what I was trying to say in this talk is a phenomenon, again, like Bayo has said, and this notion of chaology and the liminality, right? There's something fundamental about Black men that we believe that mental health is so dangerous that they need more than one person. It gives credence to the ways in which we see an overrepresentation of their death by saying they're deranged and out their mind and then have to be brought down by super forms of violence. Thank you.
Any questions for the panelists? Questions by the audience? Guess my announcement.
I have a question.
Yes.
I really want to answer. I was just sitting here thinking, if you guys did, I wish I could listen to 3 or 4 more hours of you guys talking about these things. And I may have covered this already, but when a policeman, you know, I'm proud military, so I know a little bit about weapons and deciding when to shoot. But the policemen, they always say they only have a split second to decide. And so I'm thinking, what is the greatest factor? At first, I thought that the greatest factor was I saw a weapon, and that's why I had to shoot. But after listening to you all, I'm thinking that's not the greatest factor in the decision to shoot. So let's just tell me what you think of what do you think their decision in that split second? What is the one thing that says I need to shoot?
So I could take that and then I can, other panelists can jump in as well. So from my research, I've been looking at sort of a lot of training documents and videos on how policemen are trained, and also have some, white police officers as friends, and just trying to, pick their brains. So there is this, when you're talking about the weapon, right? So the presence of a weapon as the determinant to making a split-second decision, but there's more than that. It's not just the presence of a weapon. A white male police officer literally told me, if he sees a Black male driving around with the windows down in the summer, that person is violent. That's a quote right there, direct quotation. I say it again so you can hear it. He literally says, in the summer, in Texas, that's where I live currently. He's like, in the summer, Texas can be up to 100 degrees and 110 degrees in the summer. He was like, literally, if we see someone, a black male driving around town with the windows down in the summer, that person is violent and we're gonna call back up and we're gonna chase him down. So it's not just about training. It's not just about reasonableness. Man, I'm getting emotional. I should count. Yeah, you could tell I'm passionate about this, you know, because it's a lived experience. And as someone who lives in a predominantly white town, going out every day, knowing that my body could be put down within a second. And so it's just that realization of the reality of the Black male lived experience. It's not about whether or not you look nice or you smile at white people or you wear a jacket and there's no amount of whiteness you can perform that's gonna prevent you from being killed. Because from what I found out in the training is that the very ways there's a psychological problem. It's a psychosexual pathology. The very ways white boys are socialized is to fear Black men. That's where the problem is. So you don't have to see a weapon. In the cases that I cited in my talk, there were no weapons. Yet these white people got off the hook of justice, even though investigation showed that there were no weapons. So the problem is not weapons. And I think that's why Fanon is brilliant. Fanon is saying that as a Black person, when you deal with white people in white spaces, you're already irrational. You're disconfigured. You're not human. And so I think that's how I approach that question. The question is not about what you can do to make white police officers feel comfortable or if they need to see X, Y, and Z to think that if you're a Black male, you are just marked for death, because there's something about the psychopathology that comes to the mind of police officers that when we see you, you're deadly. And they also go as far as saying, when a Black male is involved, if you hesitate, your life could be taken away from you. Think about it. So they're already dealing the standpoint of the engagement with Black male bodies is from the point of the fact that they're threats and they could kill you. So you have to always, engage with them legally. So that's how I respond to that question.
I mean, if I could add to it, I think policing is good, especially the way Bio and Dr. Ruwe talked about it, because in my theory about counterinsurgency, what I'm trying to describe is policing as counterinsurgency. This is how counterinsurgencies are implemented. Armed social workers, they have the discretion to kill. And you see this being implemented all the way back from the 1840s in Algeria, all the way going forward. What you have in the late 1960s in response to anti-colonialism, the Black Panther Party, the human rights movement, you have the collapsing of the policing field into a singular domain. The entire world is a singular domain for the application of counterinsurgency principles. So that's why you see this symmetry between the military and the police. And I know a police officer too. I have a good friend who's a police officer, and he formerly killed a Black man in Arizona. He's a white male, and he will tell you he know he was irrational. He know he killed this man in his house for a domestic violence call. He murdered this man, but the white town in Arizona let him go free. And he chose to walk away from the profession and study criminology to investigate this. But he was not criminally charged for murder. And he recognizes, something's wrong here. But I think this is how counterinsurgency works. It's the same thing that you have soldiers arguing about during the campaign in Afghanistan. Why do I have to give food to the baby? Because you're an armed social worker. That's why the police show up when you call for domestic violence, because they're armed social workers. So I wanted to throw that in there as well.
Thank you.
So for the in-person attendees, we're going to start the closing remarks in Matoka Woods, but we don't want to end this meeting prematurely. So we're also going to keep this one going. So you're welcome to stay here or head to Matoka Woods. It's totally up to y'all.
Other questions? Do we have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I have a question to that. Just scroll up.
So one of the questions from the chat was, in bringing my keynote together with Bio's paper, do you see any overlap between the justification of criminalizing the Central Park Five and your explanation of fear of Black men?
Absolutely. So I listened to that talk yesterday, and I think what Dr. Curry's point, was just sort of this idea that you get in gender theory, especially Black feminist theory, that Black men, they call it sort of Black rage theory, right? So Black men are enraged, and they always are sort of moving toward patriarchy, so to patriarchal manhood. So you get this as well in the works of Hooks, and I think specifically one of the things that Dr. Curry mentioned to rebuff that argument is that it's not based in empirical evidence. It's not, and I think that's the genius of Dr. Curry's work. He came in and said, "Hey, here's the data for looking at in the partner violence. We're looking at different categories. This is the data. This is what the empirical data shows. It doesn't actually add up to theory, and that's why I also started my talk by saying when we're engaging with the lived experience of Black men, we have to do it by factual data and not just theory. And so, yes, so the first thing is that I think that it helps to also support Dr. Curry's point that much of the characterization that we get in feminist theory about Black men really as violent beasts and rapists who are going around trying to devour people is untrue. And so if that's untrue, then what's a different theory that would help us to sort of explain that phenomena? And I think that's why Fanon becomes important for me. Fanon then says, no, actually it's a psychosexual pathology that is already within the frame of whiteness or the white community, the white dominant framework that they actually utilize to justify the killing of Black men, especially when they use fear as a justification. And I also think that it's a way in which sort of this the caricatures, caricaturized portrayal of Black men in theory as violent also helps to support this nonsense of the fear of Black men as being dangerous. Because if you have kids going to school reading these toxic theories about Black men, that's what they're going to believe. And it also would be the ways in which they would tend to engage with Black men.
Another question asks, how do we get over the knee-jerk reaction by some Black men and Black people in general in response to the oppressed status we find ourselves today, which is more or better representation in the white media?
For me, I just think we really have to just be honest. So when you think about the argument towards understanding Black male visibility and prototypability by Purdy Hugh and Vaughn's title, Intersectional Invisibility, they pretty much reinterpret the argument that the subordinate male target hypothesis puts forth to suggest that it's because these men are prototypical members in society that they garner this visibility to be executed. And I think that puts forth a very firm problematic. And Dr. Curry calls this, even a genocidal logic. I think we have to be honest about what we see in society. Because what I put forth in calling it techno-liminality is, I suppose that the representation that we get is simply a representation of dying. So there's no real way to explain that this way that we constantly see Black men being murdered on video camera is somehow visibility that garners support for them. Because even when we continue to see these images, there's no vast change after they die. So, for example, the reason why we know that George Floyd had a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds is because we constantly watch that video 1,000 times. The same thing with Eric Gardner or Philando Castile, right? Or as bio shows with a Terrence Crusher. Why is it that the Black male is always represented through social media, through 24-hour news cable television, right? through video cameras that police have on them, through iPhones, right? Why is it that we constantly see this representation of death? And how in the world can that be reinterpreted as representation that garners support? Because irrespective of whether or not we see people marching in the street, we still see police officers get off for murder. We don't see a decline in Black males dying. So what is the actual consequence of that argument? So I think we have to be brutally honest. And when we see those arguments, we have to be very conscious of what it's setting out to do. So in reference to your question, the more better. We just got to be honest that is not what it is. That it's not representation, right? Because even when you look at lynching in the past, those photographs, that memory, it's still traumatic for us today. We can remember that because we can link it to a photograph of countless Black people being lynched, Black men in particular. So I think that we just have to be extremely honest about the mechanisms of society and how that represents death, especially in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point, because we wouldn't say that lynching photos are examples of Black men having privilege. But we've engaged in a kind of ideological transformation with a certain brand of feminism and intersectionality that now says that the videos of Black men coughing up blood and dying are in fact privileged because we see them and they're represented in media more than women, right? It's a very insidious form of necropolitics that we're engaged in. So the last question before we end the panel, someone online asks, how do the panelists manage self-care? Because they know the data can be a lot to absorb as part of their profession.
I don't.
You don't manage self-care?
I don't. I think we all try our best. I'll speak for myself. I don't think it's I don't find it, as traumatic, but I rest in the hopefulness that, communicating certain information to people, things will get better in the future. So that's how I look at self-care.
For me, I have, a family, a partner, 2 little ones, 3 and 8. And I mean, honestly, they ground me. The gentleman on this panel, Dr. Curry, who, all of you gentlemen who have been, so open and willing to discuss and willing to help and willing to talk and, and willing to put their best out there for so many of us to learn from and to understand and to better articulate our conditions. That is something, that is a way that I deal with, mental health care, and knowing that, there are people out there that support me, even if, the larger society, represents me in this way, or, if you go on social media and you see, how, Black males are talked about. I find, some kind of comfort in having a panel like this, of having gentlemen that I can speak to, and having a family. And so I deal with that and being conscious that this does have an effect on our psychology. I think first just acknowledging that it definitely is weaponized against our psychology, and it has, extreme consequences. And as someone who has dealt with, police violence very directly coming out of Washington, D.C., it's something that, I definitely have to be careful of when it comes to my mental health.
Yeah, so I think I'll go next. As an African immigrant who came to the United States a few years ago, the journey's been, really tough. I remember, coming to Texas in 2015, I met my brother, Dalitso Ruwe, out there. And, so time in grad school, I was struggling with depression and all of that. And, he helped me together and all the brothers there, making sure that we pull through. So it's been tough, realistically, but I think one thing that I've learned, and also Dr. Curry as well, and I think I learned this from Dr. Curry, he would say, put your pain and use your pain to be the source of your research, to write your pain. And so it also reminds me of the liberatory praxis of Steve Biko, who literally, in the face of apartheid in South Africa, says, I would write what I like. So that in itself is just sort of has helped me to just continue to find ways, especially with this notion of fear, right? So that's part of like me literally theorizing this. It's like, no, I have to get after this. Why do people always say fear and they just kill people, just kill Black people like that? And so I do think having people that you can look up to and brothers, mentors in the field, and also more importantly, ensuring that we're writing from the place of our lived experience. And I think that for me, it's an outlet to ensure that I keep my sanity together.
Yeah, no, I mean, just echoing everybody's point, man, social family, brotherhood, and, companions and having partners has also been of help. And, just to give Dr. Curry's flowers, I mean, these are, if you know the history of how this man has had to move, right? Like he inspires so much of how we should all be thinking. And just to answer again, I'll be brief, to think about the last question I was asked, part of what we're really trying to assert and what Black male studies is really trying to point to is that we're in a point of a crisis of knowledge, right? Like under the age of Obama, as Cornel West would say, gets Black Lives Matter. Black boys start becoming the embodiment of death while we have a Black president, right? So the best of all Black social movement is that we've always had an educational paradigm put forward. This is the mark of which Black Lives Matter has not answered. We don't have a paradigm to study the humanity of Black folk and who we are as a people, which then becomes an important instrumentality of who we are, and which is the fight, right? We're having to grab back our humanity from white constructs about the fears they have about Black people and Black men, more specifically. So this project's become important, right? Somebody who doesn't have kids just yet, I think about my friends and family who had kids. What does it mean to send them to schools in which racial violence is omnipresent? Right? As a person who wants to be a father one day, this becomes a praxis. And as a Black male, and I always think about Du Bois, right? Like we tend to forget that Du Bois' notion of sociology comes from lynchings. The lynchings of Black men hurt him so much, he had to reformulate his own scientific notions, right? So I think those are the things that motivate me, right? As somebody who's in the world, potentially will be a father, but I have brothers and sisters who got kids. I at least want to say something about their humanity, and that's why it keeps me going.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. These are excellent projects and papers. I'm beyond proud. So we could give a round of applause to the panel. Y'all take care. Thank you, Rick. Thank you again.